Thank you very much, Charles. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to you all. It's very good to be here. I'd like to start with an analogy, the famous poem by Robert Frost. Two roads diverged in 1945, and the two Koreas did not travel both ways. North Korea allegedly took the road less traveled by, ideologically, politically, economically, and socially. South Korea took another road. Has that made all the difference? This is on the Korean Peninsula, where the legacy of the past, particularly for North Korea, is very much potent in the present day. So I'd like to start by talking about the impact of the recent South Korean presidential election. On the slide, you can see Yoon Suk-yeol, the now president-elect of the Conservative People Power Party. And the graph on the right-hand side offers a little bit of categorization of the different, the breakdown of the results. In blue, you have Lee Jae-myung of the Democratic Party, the ruling party at the moment, and then on the right you have Yoon, and we have a breakdown in the voting by age and by sex. So the top is for male, and the bottom is for females. And what we can see here is that actually, to call it a closely thought context is arguably a bit of an understatement. I mean, moving in South Korean politics from Moon to Yoon, this was an election of unlikables with competing domestic and foreign policy priorities. I've just highlighted a couple of points that both leadership contenders only a few weeks ago outlined in respective articles in the Foreign Affairs magazine, and it highlights some of their priorities for the peninsula, for South Korea, and also for South Korea's place in the world. Even though we have two very different South Korean presidents in terms of presidential candidates, or in terms of domestic and foreign policy priorities, now that Yoon has emerged victorious, the question remains, how much will a change of leadership and a change of political leaning have on US South Korean and US North Korean and inter-Korean relations too? Because we must not forget that Moon Jae-in, the soon-to-be lame duck, his presidential election campaign prior to his taking office in May 2017 was pledged upon, amongst other things, reconciling the polarization within South Korean politics and inter-Korean economic and political cooperation, both of which have perhaps far from succeeded. Perhaps inertia is too strong a word, but we must remember how the South Korean president as a role is in itself constrained, as are arguably all leaders, when they get into office. And as I mentioned earlier, Yoon's margin of victory was slim, 48.56% to 47.83% of the popular vote, only 200,000 more than his rival, and the electoral turnout was around 77%. There are a couple of questions that I'd like to highlight. I guess firstly, how will Yoon work with respect to the National Assembly, which remains heavily dominated by the Democratic Party? And secondly, not to say that history repeats itself, but the last two Conservative presidents have been imprisoned for bribery, corruption. This is Lee Myung-bak and his successor, the infamous Park Geun-hye, Park, who was subsequently pardoned by Moon Jae-in on Christmas Eve of last year. So what type of South Korea does Yoon inherit? Well, he inherits a South Korea that to me is perhaps a paradox. I'd like to highlight a couple of domestic legacies of the Moon era that have arguably been perhaps positive and some less positive. We may have seen growing public trust in the government. We've seen, according to the Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index, South Korea's score as a democracy rising from 2020 to 2021. We've seen South Korea being invited to the negotiating table at the G7. And Moon Jae-in's popularity was indeed rising as his tenure, as his incumbency has gone by. The South Korean economy grew 4% in 2021. This is the highest in over a decade. But that doesn't mean to say that political polarization and party polarization has not abated, far from it. We then have public health management, and the COVID-19 pandemic is very, very important here. The lessons of SARS and MERS indeed proved useful in the early days of the COVID pandemic. South Korea was widely seen, particularly in the West, as the poster child of public health management. But as we all know, cases have indeed risen. I mean, one statistic from yesterday from the South Korean media suggested that daily cases were just over 440,000. And we're seeing similar peaks in COVID cases in China and Hong Kong. The Moon administration has pledged greater healthcare and childcare benefits, and it's seen the minimum wage increase. But this is all in relative terms, one could argue. We've also seen Moon Jae-in pledge to increase employment, but also in terms of the environment, to support the transition to a digital and green economy. This was his Korean New Deal that was set up in 2020. And as he said, it was the aim to set the foundation for Korea's next 100 years. But there's obviously a long way to go. Fine, the working week may have been reduced, but it pales in comparison to other Western liberal democracies. And there are less positive legacies of the Moon administration, which Yoon will have to deal with. As I've mentioned, political polarization. Secondly, rising house prices and soaring household debt seem to be tethering the people away from the leadership. I mean, during Moon's first 4 years in power, house prices rose as much as 35%. And Moon himself has admitted that his administration has failed to manage this balance between supply and demand. Household debt, I mean, one statistic in June 2021 reached 1.8 trillion Korean won, $1.5 trillion. Economically, the chaebol, the family-run conglomerate of which South Korea is infamous for, still seem to be relied upon, even though the ruling Democratic Party tried to pass a bill to limit the power of these conglomerates. And even though South Korea has been initially successful at managing COVID, we've seen harsh and very stringent quarantine rules, interestingly relaxed quite quickly after Yoon's victory a few days ago, which have stymied growth, investment, and tourism. I mentioned Moon Jae-in's anti-discrimination law, namely because Moon Jae-in's pledge, one of his pledges, was his role as a human rights lawyer in the past. The gender pay gap in South Korea, LGBT rights as well, these all remain issues that the new incumbent will have to deal with. Will he deal with it is another question. We've all seen Yoon Suk-yeol's statements, and particularly those emanating from his wife, also regarding questions of discrimination as well. Yoon has made clear his pledges: lower corporation taxes, easing loan restrictions in the housing market, promoting startups, but also calling for South Korea to step up in international relations. And I'd like to turn to this now. For Yoon, South Korea needs to step up. What does he mean for that? Well, he says that actually South Korea, as we know, has gone from rags to riches post-Korean War, but more needs to be done for it to be, as to quote him, a responsible and respected member of international relations. He's recently published a report of his administration's proposals for domestic and foreign policy. And one of them seems to highlight the importance of materializing relations between South Korea and China based on mutual respect. What does this look like? Particularly as South Korea also has to balance economic relations with China and its political alliances with the US. In international relations, we all hope that states in the East Asian region will not be forced to choose between allying with the US and allying with China in the future. The North Korean issue as well, I'll say a little bit more about this in a few moments, is perhaps one outstanding and unresolved issue that is currently an obstacle between Seoul and Beijing. How this will be resolved by the Yoon administration is an issue that we need to pay attention to. Brandon later is going to say more about supply chain challenges for South Korea and questions of exports, but this point about balancing economic and political ties is very important and is a challenge that the Yoon administration will have to reconcile with most carefully indeed. I've placed AUKUS on there because one of the proposals that Yoon has pledged is for South Korea to gain membership of the Quad and to accelerate the comprehensive and progressive agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. So Yoon has proposed robust alliances with the US, working with the Quad, and also strengthening South Korea's role in terms of its great power status even further. I use the term great power status, interestingly, because at the moment, discussions about South Korea as an economy, we still see it as a sort of middle economy, emerging market economy. Yet the rhetoric that we've seen from South Korean administrations, both conservative and liberal, particularly Moon Jae-in, really place more emphasis on the sort of great power status. And then if we just move closer to home into Korean relations, Yoon Suk-yeol has said that South Korea should lead sanctions imposition, and he has made clear how a return to the action for action approach might be likely. This is when North Korea takes particular steps towards denuclearization, and the international community, South Korea, the US, other actors respond. We have seen this emphasis before, not least multilaterally, in the six-party talks during the early 2000s, and we all know how that ended. North Korea withdrew, conducted its second nuclear test in 2009. A big question we have regarding inter-Korean relations, therefore, is it's all very well for the Yoon administration to state that it pledges to focus on humanitarian support whilst maintaining harsh rhetoric and sanctions. But harsh rhetoric and harsh sanctions, what are they going to achieve? Will we see a continued stagnation in inter-Korean ties? And I say continued because inter-Korean ties are not good at the moment. And as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, is it the case that North Korea policy on the part of South Korea really does require Pyongyang to make the first move before any progress is made? Because indeed, I'd like to just go back a little in time. If we go back to the last two conservative administrations in South Korea, we had Lee Myung-bak, who again had his so-called Vision 3000 project of denuclearization and openness, pledged to help increase North Korea's GDP through aid and investment only if Pyongyang denuclearized. This was, of course, unacceptable to the North. Afterwards, the Park Geun-hye administration, well, after Park was elected, North Korea conducted its third nuclear test in February 2013. And even though the Park administration pursued a policy of trust politic, a combination of economic cooperation and leadership, focusing on providing aid, providing cultural contact in exchange for better North Korean behavior, fewer provocations, for instance, North Korea did not respond in kind. Park famously described North Korea's isolation as self-imposed in her inauguration ceremony. It just goes to show you how far harsh rhetoric on the part of South Korea goes with respect to the North. And indeed, even during the later stages of the Park Geun-hye administration, we saw North Korea continue to call out the US for US-ROK defensive maneuvers. And even though during the early administration, Park herself called for discussions to reopen the inter-Korean economic ventures at Kaesong, following continued North Korean provocations, South Korea temporarily closed the complex in February 2016. So what's going on, not just in South Korea, but in North Korea? What has the Yoon administration got to deal with? I mean, the broader point stands that with every administration in power, whether in the US, whether in South Korea, the menu of available options to deal with the North decreases. I mean, one can go back and try past options in a new context, and obviously that has its relevance because North Korea Today is not North Korea 10, 15, 20 years ago. The same is true of South Korea, the same is true of the US. But we also have election cycles. The fact that the South Korean presidency is a 5-year non-renewable term. In the US, you have 4 8-year presidencies. And obviously in North Korea and China, you have the leader for life. And so this conflict and this tension, particularly when there is a particular policy path set out in Washington of either engagement or containment or something in between, and the opposite in Seoul, not only strains the US-ROK alliance, but also further reduces what South Korea can do. Or does it? Before I get to that, I'd like to focus a little bit more on, as I said, on North Korean domestic politics. In my view, COVID-19 was the sanction above all sanctions, and it's quite ironic that the most effective sanction on the North Korean economy was one that was self-imposed. We've seen the border closure of January 2020. We've seen huge decreases in trade, not least with its main trading partner of China. And even though there are signs that economic interactions between Beijing and Pyongyang are trickling back, they are trickling. Interestingly, North Korea remains the land of the COVID-free. It remains that the regime says that it has no COVID cases in its territory. This is, of course, extremely doubtful. But I'd like to highlight, I think if there's one point to highlight, how North Korea has used coronavirus as an excuse to quote unquote retreat inwards, so to speak. Even though the engagement and the sort of theatrics of the Trump era between Trump and Kim Jong-un may have perhaps reduced the relevance of the moniker of the Hermit Kingdom, which we traditionally apply to North Korea, we are now seeing a retreat inwards. We've seen ongoing ideological conferences on the part of local party officials and workers last year and this year. And we've seen Kim Jong-un himself take a harsher line on societal control, particularly on the youth. There was a notable moment, I think, in April last year when Kim Jong-un, in addressing the Youth League, even singled out hairstyles, fashion, attire, speech, music, popular culture. So it is part of a wider strategy to curb out foreign influence. And Kim has said that just as North Korea may have to learn to live with the effects of sanctions, so too will its people have to learn to live with the effects of COVID-induced measures. Interestingly, the DPRK has refused to accept vaccines, not least from COVAX, the UN vaccine scheme in relation to Gavi. But we are seeing discussions in this regard, whether if the right vaccine comes, will the North accept? Surely a vaccinated North Korea is perhaps one of the only ways in which North Korea can, quote unquote, open up to pre-COVID levels. And again, in terms of North Korea's foreign policy, what we see is, in my view, a continuation of counter-hegemonic strategies designed to delegitimize the US. We see the narrative of the US hostile policy continue to feature in Kim Jong-un's rhetoric, and we see North Korea increasingly assert its self-perception as a nuclear-armed state. This is what it wants. It wants recognition as a nuclear-armed state, and eventually it wants the international community to give in and ultimately recognize it as such. The first year of the Biden administration has arguably been sort of quite ambivalent. We've seen rhetoric of diplomacy and deterrence, upholding the rules-based international order, the US-South Korea alliance, but we haven't seen any concrete steps moving forward in terms of US-North Korea ties. So what does this mean? I mean, I've had to update this slide as of this morning. UK time, we've seen North Korea conduct a failed launch of an unknown projectile. Not only have we seen missile tests of increasing scope and sophistication and of new systems, hypersonic systems, long-range systems, even a train-launched ballistic missile, which was launched last year and again this year in January. We've also seen further testing in recent weeks, euphemistically disguised as satellite launches. And North Korea's rhetoric regarding satellites is always the same. We saw this in 2012, 2013. The regime made clear that if other states can test satellites, why can't we? These satellite launches obviously are disguised launches and testing new technology, possibly of ICBM technology, particularly the most recent ones. So we're seeing this cycle of provocations, sanctions, provocations, which we've witnessed in North Korean politics in the early 2010s, possibly resurrect itself. Okay, the last North Korean nuclear test was in 2017. We saw a moratorium imposed on long-range and nuclear testing in 2018, but this was crucially self-imposed, and importantly, the Kim regime has made very clear that it will and can break this moratorium if it does see fit. And obviously, we should not be surprised. We all know what North Korea does to agreements or bits of paper. It breaks them. So I'd like to finish by talking about the ongoing lessons of Ukraine. There's a lot of speculation as to whether North Korea's recent missile testing, the so-called satellite launches, were a direct response to international attention being focused elsewhere regarding Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the North Korea-Russia relationship. I think I'd like to make 2 points. Firstly, that North Korea does not behave in isolation, and that now indeed is an opportunity or a window of opportunity to engage in provocations. And indeed, Yoon Suk-yeol made very clear that this is his view as well. Nevertheless, North Korea's actions are not solely in response to international factors. This testing arguably would have continued given North Korea's actions in January and late last year. So what does this mean, broadly speaking, for South Korea's role as well? Only a couple of days ago, Moon Jae-in's National Security Advisor, Seo-hoon, briefed Yoon on North Korea and on Ukraine. I mean, it's perhaps a euphemism to say that Yoon has got a very difficult South Korea, domestically and in terms of foreign policy, to take over. There was a lot of initial speculation as to why South Korea did not enforce independent sanctions on Russian banks and instead joined existing multilateral efforts. And indeed, even only just under a month ago, the South Korean government made clear it was not considering unilateral steps. Okay, closer to the present day, we've seen South Korea sever ties with Russia's central bank, for instance, but the wording of this is very interesting. We see that South Korea's sanctions are in line with US sanctions. There's discourse of the fact that the US persuaded South Korea to follow suit. This links to bigger questions of South Korea's political place in international relations. Arguably, if South Korea wants its status as a great power, politically and economically, ought it to take a more independent stance in international relations. We've all seen that Moon Jae-in acted as a mediator between Pyongyang and Washington, particularly during the days of engagement between Trump and Kim Jong-un. Nevertheless, being a mediator, in my view, is not sufficient. Being a mediator is helpful, but we've seen what the outcome was. The outcome was basically a sort of quasi-return to the status quo. This was obviously before COVID. So we should continue to expect North Korea's missile and nuclear testing to keep going. I mean, this is what Kim Jong-un himself made very clear at a speech to the Workers' Party Congress in January 2021. He had what one could term a shopping list, a checkbox list of missile and nuclear capabilities to get through. Tactical nuclear weapons, hypersonic glide vehicles, sea-based nuclear strategic weapons, reconnaissance satellites, to name but a few. How the new South Korean president will deal with it is another issue. As I've said before, the menu of available options decreases. And what the Yoon administration's approach will mean for relations with the US is also something we need to bear in mind. All the while, issues on the peninsula in South Korea and in North Korea will continue. Thank you. I'd like to leave it there.
Okay, thank you very much. If you can stop sharing your screen, Brandon, if you can share your screen.
Indeed, thank you, Charles, and thank you, Edward. Some fascinating observations there. Clearly, interesting times ahead, both as we see how the policy evolves under the new president in the south, and as you have so very well described, as we look to see what reactions may emerge from the north. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone. Just a very quick introduction to myself and Evershed Sutherland in Asia before I then hand over to my colleague Brandon, who will share some thoughts on the election and the situation in Korea from a legal and business perspective. My name is Charles Butcher. I'm a corporate partner based in Hong Kong, and I lead our M&A practice and team in Asia. I've been in Hong Kong for quite a long time now, been based here since 2007. Prior to that, I practiced for a number of years in Australia, in Sydney and Perth, and also in Ho Chi Minh City. But Hong Kong has been home for some time now, and very much running a pan-Asia transactional practice. Quick bit of background on Evershed Sutherland for those not so familiar. We're a very large global law firm, top 20, with 74 offices around the world and around 5,000 staff. In Asia, we are full service, so we have all the traditional practice areas, my own being corporate, but we also cover banking and finance, litigation and disputes, employment, antitrust, regulatory, all of the usual good law firm stuff. As I mentioned, we very much have a pan-Asia approach to how we play our transactions here. And that means that we help clients on investments and deals anywhere in the APAC region. One of the most interesting markets that we look at, particularly in recent years, has been Korea. Where we've seen a lot of very interesting activity going on, increasing activity for many of our clients, and that's both on the inbound investment front for global corporates looking to do business and undertake deals in Korea, but also equally for a lot of Korean clients, chaebols, Korean corporates, other asset managers and investors who are, I think, increasingly confident, and for reasons which I think Brandon will touch on in a moment, we are seeing a lot more outbound activity as they go in search of interesting other markets for expansion. Globally, we've been expanding our Korea practice and our Korea practice group over the last couple of years. We've had some new teams joined in the US, and then at the end of last year, I was delighted to welcome Brandon to our corporate M&A team based in Hong Kong. Brandon is formerly practicing lawyer in Seoul, spent many years there, and very experienced in handling transactional deals, both inbound and outbound. So I will leave it there, and I will hand over now to Brandon to share his views with a little bit more of a legal and business side bent. Over to you, Brandon.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Charles, and nice to meet everyone here. So before I discuss the implications of the election outcome for businesses, I wanted to first give you a snapshot of South Korea and its economy in simple stats. Obviously, for my presentation, I will discuss the implications of the election to business environment in South Korea only. South Korea has a population of approximately 52 million, and its GDP per capita in 2020 was approximately $31,500 US. South Korea did relatively well during the pandemic period compared to other OECD countries, and its economy contracted by only 0.9% in 2020, and its economy has further bounced back last year, and the growth rate in 2021 is estimated to be between 3 and 4%. The country's inflation rate recorded 2.5% last year, and it was the highest in the last decade. Korea's unemployment rate was about 3.9% in 2020, and it has been staying at such level in the recent years. Overall, South Korea's economy is the 10th largest in the world and the 4th largest in Asia, only after China, Japan, and India, with national GDP of 1.65 trillion US dollars in 2020. Despite its limited domestic market size, Korea could rapidly increase the overall pie of its economy, mostly through exports of the last half century. Also, Korea is one of the very few countries after the World War II which could successfully develop industrial capabilities across various sectors, from literally ground zero to the level of so-called advanced countries. And it has a fairly broad spectrum of competitive industries, such as semiconductors, automobiles, heavy industries like shipbuilding, defense industry, chemicals, steelmaking, nuclear power industry, etc., etc. Recently, Korea is even making a surprising footprint in the global cultural content industries, represented by K-pop and BTS, Squid Game on Netflix, and the Oscar-winning movie Parasite. In terms of the national economic structure, Korea's economy is heavily dependent on export. Such heavy reliance on export has some pros and cons, but it was definitely helpful in minimizing damages during the pandemic since 2020. As mentioned, Korea experienced a modest 0.9% GDP decline in 2020 and had returned to pre-pandemic level of economic activity by mid-2021. Korea's economic recovery has benefited from a surge in demand for consumer durables during the pandemic period, and its position as a global leader in semiconductors and consumer electronics enabled it to capitalize on such surge in demand. Against such backdrop, I now move on to discuss business environment in Korea and the expected changes in Korea as a result of the election of Yoon Suk-yeol as the next president. Since the financial crisis and the IMF bailout in late 1990s, Korea has been always open to foreign direct investment activities across different governments, whether they be liberal or conservative. And Korea has been known to be a market which is relatively friendly to foreign investors. In fact, FDI in Korea reached its all-time high of approximately 30 billion US dollars last year. And the 5-year average of annual FDI in Korea under the outgoing President Moon Jae-in increased by about 34% compared to that under his predecessor. However, there are indications that Korea may not be attracting FDI as much as it should, considering the size of its economy and its overall economic stature. For instance, according to one study by the Korea Economic Research Institute, Korea's net FDI ratio, which compares the amount of FDI with the amount of outbound investment by Korean companies, has continuously decreased during the period from 2005 to 2019 compared to that of G5 nations. G5 nations being the group of 5 emerging economies, which are Brazil, China, India, Mexico, and South Africa. In terms of quality of FDI, the ratio of greenfield projects out of all FDI in Korea decreased by 16.8% in the recent 5-year period, while the same ratio out of outbound activities increased by 6.9% during the same period. This means that FDI in manufacturing facilities in Korea decreased, while investments in building the factories by Korean companies in other countries increased, which raises concerns for a rise in the unemployment rate in Korea. Also, according to one study, FDI confidence index for Korea was ranked in the 21st place out of 25 top economies, which is not terrible, but it appears that it can do much better than this. In particular, Korea generally has higher corporate income tax rate and tighter regulations than its comparables. So obviously, this is an issue for foreign investors, given that 3 most important factors in making FDI decisions would perhaps be taxes, regulations, and the flexibility of labor market. However, I think this is where the election of Yoon as the next president in Korea might have some positive implications for foreign investors looking to invest in Korea. Yoon Suk-yeol's economy policy catchphrase is fair and innovative economy and dynamic and innovative growth. Regardless of what exactly this means as political catchphrase, one thing is clear. Yoon is a member of the Conservative Party and advocates small government, low taxes, free market, and private sector-led approaches. His key economic policy pledges made during the campaign include shift to pro-business policies in general, emergency support package worth $45 billion to small merchants and businesses as part of the pandemic relief, lower taxes on corporations, deregulation, real estate tax reform, government support for key and future industries, and more flexible labor regulations. Among these policies, lower corporate taxation, deregulations, and more flexible labor regulations should catch the eyes of foreign investors. Yoon has been a prosecutor all his life and has less than 1 year of political career before he was elected as the next president of Korea. However, his father was a famous economics professor in Korea, and this may have affected his mentality when it comes to economics. Whatever the reason is, Yoon has been openly and very publicly advocating free market policies, minimal government intervention, and laissez-faire capitalism, and has been critical of the government-led economy and the government's intervention in the market. So we can reasonably expect that Yoon's government will take more pro-business and pro-private sector policies and advocate lower taxes on corporations. On deregulations, during his campaign, Yoon mentioned he will get rid of unnecessary regulations and focus on nurturing companies that can lead the fourth industrial revolution in order to turn Korea's declining growth potential. So Yoon announced that he would lift some 80 corporate regulations to help generate growth and create jobs. It is not clear which 80 regulations Yoon's government will deregulate immediately, but it is expected that they will accommodate voices from the major corporations and industry associations and target such regulations which have been designated as anti-growth and anti-investment obstacles. Also, the labor market flexibility is one of the key areas of interest for foreign investors in Korea, and many of the foreign investors indeed have often complained about high level of labor protection under Korean law and inflexibility of the labor market. The outgoing government of the Democratic Party is the Liberal Party, and they traditionally have been taking policy approaches more favorable to employees and labor unions. And the outgoing government has also introduced pro-labor laws and regulations, such as increase in minimum wage, strict enforcement of 52 weekly work hours, and appointment of employee representatives as directors of certain corporations. On the other hand, Yoon calls for a labor market flexibility and criticized the current 52-hour work week as a complete policy failure. So it is expected that the laws and regulations which are deemed more favorable for labor's interests are likely to be completely abolished, or their scope is likely to be limited or reduced. Regarding the government support for specific industries, Yoon's government is expected to increase its policy support for future industries such as future vehicles, battery and biomedical industries, and the energy industries, both for nuclear power and for renewables industries. So all in all, given Yoon's basic stance of small government, low taxes, free market, and private sector-led approaches to the nation's economy, and his policy pledges on lower taxes, deregulation, and more flexible labor system, it would be reasonable to expect that the FDI environment in Korea may become more favorable to foreign investors in the coming years. Now, I want to change the gear a little bit and discuss a slightly different agenda, which is supply chain challenges for South Korea in connection with the ongoing tensions between the United States and China, and how the Yoon government is expected to handle the issue differently from the outgoing government, what it means from a business perspective. During the current United States-China tension and the related supply chain decoupling efforts, United States has been pushing Korea to play a more active, reliable, and resilient role in global supply chain realignment. However, the outgoing government has not taken more active actions in support of demands coming from Washington and took more prudent approaches, which they call strategic ambiguity. Such approach appears to be understandable in a sense because South Korea is in a precarious position of balancing its economic activities with China, with economic engagement and security ties with the United States. In fact, China is Korea's #1 economic partner in terms of its export activities, as China comprises more than 25% of total exports of Korea. However, there is a reason why the United States has been pushing for more active roles from Korea, and it is not just because Korea is a bloodshed longtime ally to the United States. In fact, Korea is probably the only single country that can cooperate effectively with the United States in 3 of the 4 vulnerable industry areas identified by Biden's supply chain report released in June last year. These 3 areas are: #1, semiconductor manufacturing; #2, large capacity batteries like those for electric vehicles; and #3, pharmaceuticals and active pharmaceutical ingredients. Whereas China plays a leading role in the other one area, which is critical minerals and materials. So Korea is a key ally in US global policies and Washington's competition with Beijing, particularly in the context of the recent global supply chain disruptions. Under such circumstances, Yoon has been very vocal about his desire to move the center of gravity more towards Washington and move away from China if necessary. He said the new government will seek more cooperation with the United States for high-tech industries and participate in the wider free trade pacts and economic alliances in order to secure a stable supply of key raw materials and parts. He also mentioned that Korea will participate more in discussions of the Quad, which is comprised of the United States, Australia, India, and Japan, with a view to joining the Quad as an official member in the future. This is interesting because the Quad's main agenda are understood to strengthen security and economic ties between the member nations against China's interest in the region. In addition, Yoon mentioned his plan to use the manufacturing technologies of Korea in the semiconductors and battery industries, which are the key sectors in the current supply chain decoupling, as a leverage to seek international cooperation with the United States, Japan, and the European countries, which possess more origin technologies than Korea. In fact, after the election, Yoon has been having conference calls with the president and prime ministers of the United States, Japan, and the UK, in that order. Also, according to media reports, Yoon is planning to have calls with the heads of Australia and India within this week. And as you know, these are member states of the Quad. But interestingly, Yoon has not had any call with the Chinese President Xi Jinping yet. This seems to imply a clear policy shift because traditionally the president-elects of Korea had first calls with the United States, China, Japan, and Russia, largely in such order right after the election. However, as China is still the largest export destination for Korea and decoupling from the Chinese market may have some serious economic implications in the short term, it remains to be seen how far Korea can and will go in terms of decoupling its economy from China. However, at least it seems clear that Yoon will go in that route in the next 5 years by pursuing closer ties with the United States, both from security and economic perspectives. One of the implications of such policy shift from a business perspective may be that Korean corporations will try to reduce their reliance on the Chinese market, and in some cases, it could even accelerate exit from China. In fact, even before the presidential election, sorry about that. Even before the presidential election this time and all the policy initiatives announced by Yoon during his campaign, we feel that for various reasons, there already has been a sentiment among the Korean clients to move away from China and to investment in other countries, such as the United States, European countries, Southeast Asian countries, and even India. For example, most of the largest outbound investments made by the Korean companies in the recent years include investments in the United States, such as SK Hynix acquisition of NAND flash business of Intel in the semiconductor area, and Samsung Electronics' decision to invest $17 billion to build a semiconductor factory in Texas, which is the largest FDI ever in Texas. Also, especially after the THAAD incident where China retaliated economically against South Korea for allowing the United States military to deploy the high-performance missile defense system on the Korean soil, Korean conglomerates like Lotte had to pull out of the Chinese market almost involuntarily. There are also many other examples of voluntary exits, however. For instance, Samsung closed its only TV factory in China in 2020 and moved its display manufacturing factory from China to India last year. Hyundai Motor sold its largest plant in China in May last year and announced the construction of the plant in Indonesia, which is the largest in the region. I also personally worked on a deal where a Chinese logistics subsidiary of the Korean conglomerate exited from China. And so based on our discussion with the Korean clients these days, I think the general trend among the Korean companies is more of an exit from China rather than making investment into China. So if not China, where are the Korean companies turning to in connection with their supply chain needs? In Asia, they are turning to ASEAN countries, which are mostly Southeast Asian countries and also India. Korea has the strong manufacturing-based economy represented by automobiles, electronics, and others consumables. And many Korean companies in these industries have established their key overseas manufacturing base in the Southeast Asian region, especially in Indonesia and Vietnam, and many of them are looking to further expand it. To give you a recent example from my own experience, I worked on a deal representing the Korean clients seeking to establish a joint venture in Indonesia, which will manufacture batteries for electric cars. For this transaction, we had to negotiate with the Indonesian government for investment incentives to be provided to the joint venture, such as tax exemptions. But one of the key elements of negotiation was the preferential treatment of the Korean companies in the development of nickel mining in Indonesia. And nickel, of course, is one of the key materials for batteries. And this can be seen as one of the examples where the Korean companies are trying to diversify its supply chain of raw materials to the countries where they feel less political risks. I think this trend will only be strengthened and will continue under the Yoon's government. Also, with the increase of South Korean investment in India, cooperation between India and South Korea in the realignment of current supply chains may help to build a new India-centric supply chain. Whether it is feasible or not in the short term, it is difficult to anticipate at this point. But one thing clear is that the new government of Yoon will seek to expand the cooperation with India as well as part of its efforts to diversify and stabilize supply chains. All in all, Southeast Asian countries and India will remain as an important pivot point for South Korea's southern and global diplomacy and economic policy, as the new government will seek to further expand such partnerships. So that's it for my presentation, and thanks for listening. I will now hand it over to Charles for Q&A.
Okay, if you'd like to stop sharing your slides. Okay, thank you very much indeed for an excellent presentation. I have one question. Edward, perhaps you can talk about the what North Korea is likely to do in terms of making sure that it's noticed as the Ukraine crisis occurs? Is it likely to do anything stupid?
Thanks, Charles. I think that, I mean, you said, I think the answer is in the question that you posed. North Korea is noticed. I think North Korea is going to continue its already sort of preset route regarding expanding not only the number but also the type and the sophistication of its missile capabilities. We saw only a couple of weeks ago Kim Jong-un inspect the satellite launching ground at Tongchang-ni at Seoul. And again, this is interestingly a site where, after the first summit between Trump and Kim in June 2018, and after a summit between Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un in September 2018, North Korea pledged to dismantle and actively took steps to do so. And then we saw in December 2019, North Korea test from this same site. So I think we're going to see North Korea continue on its missile nuclear capabilities road. Is it going to do anything stupid? I think North Korea wants just to prolong the status quo, and also it wants to continue being the beneficiary of economic benefits from China. We all know China's policy towards North Korea, which to me seems one of stability. So long as there is stability on the peninsula, China is happy to keep providing a bit of cash to the north to ensure this stability. I don't think, I mean, it depends on what you mean by stupid. I mean, we've seen, it's interesting because we've seen North Korea call out the US as the root cause of the Ukraine crisis, and we've seen North Korea actively express or increasingly vocal support for Russia, but such attestations from the foreign ministry, for instance, have been quite infrequent. And I think that's a deliberate maneuver.
Okay, Brandon, there's a question here on what South Korea's strategy is towards Latin America. Can you handle that?
Well, yeah, I can share my thoughts on that. Latin America, to be honest, was not, very often discussed during the campaign, the presidential race. I think the most of focus was on the relationship with the United States, China, Japan, and some of the European countries, as mentioned. But as Korea seeks to diversify their supply chain options, and also as Korea will seek closer cooperation and ties with the United States, I think they will also try to, the Korean companies especially, they will try to look into the opportunities in Latin America. In fact, personally, I have, experience of working on a deal in Brazil for the auto parts manufacturer for their, acquisition of a parts plant there. And also I have, financial clients in Korea asking whether, we can provide any, information on available targets in the Latin America area. So I think there will be some opportunities in that regard. But as I discussed, right now the focus was more on the relationship with the United States and China and Japan and other European countries.
Okay, Charles, do you have any final comments at all? And then I think we'll wrap up after that.
Yeah, sure. And perhaps just to finish off on Brandon's comments there, I think it's probably fair to say, as Brandon suggested, that Latin America is not necessarily the highest priority outbound destination. But as I mentioned in my brief comments earlier, what we have seen consistently from the Korean corporates and chaebols and investors is that they are more actively seeking outbound targets everywhere. And whilst perhaps some of the more low-hanging fruit and what we've seen initially has been into other parts of Asia, and as Brandon mentioned, in particular the US, I think there are certain areas where the corporates will be looking to places like Latin America and other parts of South America, indeed, along particular industry and sector lines, things like automotive supplies, consumer electronics, and so forth, where there is good opportunity for them to make investments for supply chain purposes, but also ultimately, I think, for markets. So, in answer to your question there, Claudia, I think it will be a watch this space, and there is strategy there, but it's probably not going to be a flood of investment. The only other point I wanted to make, aside from thanking all of our speakers today and all of our joiners, was we're very happy to hear from anyone. If you do have any questions about investment into Korea or investing out from Korea and Korean outbound activities, we're always very happy to hear from you. Thanks, Charles. Nothing further from me.